99% fatality. Why you wouldn't survive a single day at sea in the 1500s. It sounds like a provocation, a headline meant to shock, but step with me into the belly of a typical merchant ship from that century, and you'll see why the image isn't as absurd as it first appears. Imagine a wooden hull pitching on a slow ocean, lantern light guttering below decks, the smell of tar and sweat so thick it feels like a second skin. A man gropes for a cup from a barrel and takes a swallow of brown brackish water. By dusk he is convulsing. By night a handful of men are sick. By morning the surgeon is feverish too. The helmsman has been swept overboard in a squall, and the pumps are choked with rot. In a sealed world no larger than a few dozen souls, one failure can cascade into many. The 99% is a rhetorical lens, not a precise tally, but it helps frame a hypothesis worth testing. On a typical 1500 ship, overlapping and immediate threats, biological, environmental, and human, could make surviving a single catastrophic day exceedingly unlikely for an unprepared passenger. The age of discovery was, above all, a world of movement. Massive European demand for spices, silver, slaves, and new commodities drove ships farther and more often than ever before. The vessels themselves ranged from nimble caravels and lateen-rigged caravels of explorers to larger carracks and early galleons pressed into merchant service. Crews were a mixed bag. Professional seamen who knew ropes and currents, pressed men with no sea training, apprentices, a few craftsmen, a carpenter, a cook, a boatswain, and often a handful of passengers whose social standing meant nothing once the weather turned. Voyages stitched distant ports into a single network. What mattered in Lisbon might be echoed in Lagos, Veracruz, or Malacca. That global web made profitable commerce possible, but it also made the ocean a highway for hazards. Pests, pathogens, spoiled stores, and rumors that could travel faster than help. If you want the full, gritty picture of how those threats multiply and collide, stay with me, and consider subscribing so you don't miss the deeper reconstructions I'll walk through next. Start with the Invisible Army. Below decks in these wooden ships was a cramped, dim world. Hammocks or simple planks, barrels, sacks of grain, and the bilge, a dark, foul sump where salted fish, human waste, and rainwater mingled, filled the lower spaces. Rats found refuge in every seam, slipping through scuttles and chewing at the very stores meant to keep men alive. Lice burrowed in clothing. Fleas hopped from furred stowaways to human legs. Those pests were not curiosities. They were vectors, biological couriers that carried diseases from port to port. Contemporary accounts and ship logs describe men afflicted with a flux, or feverish with ague and pains, terms that cover a range of illnesses historians now associate with dysentery, typhus, and septic infections from wound contamination. We cannot, and should not, write modern diagnostic labels on every corpse, but we can describe how these conditions behaved, and why they turned a single day into a lethal race. Imagine a vignette. A young seaman below decks, call him Thomas plausibly, but not claimed from any single source, has spent the morning scrubbing a deck and mending a sail. He is thirsty, his mouth dry from salt and sun. He lowers a wooden cup into a barrel that was supposed to hold fresh water, but now smells faintly of rot. A small rodent has been trapped under a bungboard, and the liquid tastes of iron. He drinks. 2 hours later he is doubled over with cramps. Within 12, he cannot stand. The ship's surgeon, more often a barber with basic surgical tools than a learned physician, comes with a pewter basin, a rag, and a lancet. His options are blunt and dangerous. Relieve supposed humors by bleeding, stitch, or cauterize a wound. Set a poultice of herbs and vinegar that may do more to burn skin than heal it. Antiseptic thinking is almost entirely absent. Boiling instruments is rare because small ships cannot spare enough good water. Without reliable antibiotics, a simple wound becomes an open invitation to microbes, and a bout of dysentery can remove the will and strength to bail, to lash rigging, or even to stagger to the rail. Water itself is a story of slow, hidden betrayal. Fresh water was precious. It was stored in wooden casks that could be contaminated by leakage, by the rotting of staves, and by the repeated drawing of cups with unwashed hands. Sailors often had to make do with brackish mixtures or with water drawn from the bilge when stores ran low. The presence of human fecal matter in the living spaces was not unknown. Latrines were primitive and often inadequate, and strong winds or a hard pitch could slosh waste into areas close to casks. Dysentery, or any waterborne infection, can move fast under those conditions. One contaminated scoop, one shared cup, and within hours dozens can be sick. Whereas scurvy plays out over weeks, these infections can take men down overnight. Rats are not merely a pest problem. They play a narrative role in how quickly contagion moves. They ate into sacks of grain, shredded linens, and chewed the outer protective layers of casks. Their droppings and fleas rode in their fur. Historians have likened them to moving colonies, and contemporary chroniclers speak of ships overrun by vermin. In a single night, a nest can see dozens of fleas that begin to bite in the dark. The result is not just discomfort. Body lice carrying Rickettsia prowazekii, plausibly the agent behind epidemic typhus in many historical outbreaks, spread from man to man in cramped quarters. Fever sets in, confusion follows, and once key members of the crew are debilitated, the ship's operational resilience collapses. Shipboard medicine itself was a hazard. Surgeons carried saws, knives, forceps, and a store of remedies rooted in Galenic humoral theory. Bloodletting, cupping, topical plasters, and foul-smelling but commonly used substances, vinegar, alcohol, and sometimes mercury. Amputation was used for destructive limb wounds, often without anesthesia beyond a belt and a draught of wine. The procedure might stop bleeding, but infection remained almost certain. And even aside from active treatment, the presence of invasive procedures carried out in damp, fetid spaces increased mortality. A surgeon who made one mistake, or who himself succumbed to fever, could not be quickly replaced. Ships carried a surgeon's tools, but not the knowledge or resources for effective antisepsis. If biological agents make a ship a tinderbox, the environment can be the spark. The Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are littered with sudden, merciless weather. Squalls build with little notice. A single rogue wave can send men overboard, smash the lee gangway, rip the rigging, or snap a mast. Wood itself is alive with threats. Shipworms, tiny mollusk-like animals known as teredo, eat into oak and pine, undermining hulls from the inside. A vessel might look sound on deck yet be hollowed where caulking once held. Caulking itself, oakum and tar packed into seams, suffers from rot and strain. A ship's bilge pump, a manual device reliant on human labor, can be choked with muck or lose efficiency when the crankers are too ill or too few. In a storm, a failed pump turns a manageable leak into a race to patch or to abandon ship. Picture a dawn squall, low black clouds racing like a closed fist across the sky. The wind lurches from a whisper to a howl. On deck, a rope snaps under sudden tension. A sail shivers, then tears. A helmsman gives a shout. The wheel slips, and a man is flung from the rail, his body taken in the white noise of breaking sea. In calm conditions, a frantic swimmer might be hauled back aboard. In a raw squall, with lines whipping and heavy seas rolling, rescue is a fantasy. Those left to maneuver a crippled craft find their tasks multiplied. Steer, trim sails, patch leaks, keep the sick alive, and bail. A storm reduces the ship's margin for error to near zero. Structural failures also cut faster than we might imagine. A shattered mast or snapped backstay does more than stop progress. It can swing heavy spars across decks and through hulls, decking men in one fell move. A damaged rudder can leave the vessel without directional control, and at the mercy of currents that drive it onto shoals. In many cases, the sea did the work no enemy could. A battered hull was vulnerable to splintering and to catastrophic breaches that filled compartments faster than hands could empty them. That's not an abstract danger. It is immediate, noisy, and final. All of this is made exponentially worse by human action and the social pressures aboard. Ships were hierarchical but fragile communities. The captain wielded life and death power and had to make impossible calls. Throw damaged cargo to save the ship, cut loose a poorly stowed boat to save the rest, or refuse to bring an ill man ashore at a foreign port for fear of quarantine and confiscation. Discipline could be brutal. Punishments intended to enforce order, floggings, confinement, or public humiliation, sometimes brutalized men beyond usefulness and created resentments that simmered. Theft of rations was common, and food was a scarce commodity the longer the voyage. A handful of stale biscuits, a few salted fish, a cask of spoiled beer. When the stores dwindled, fights erupted. Contemporary narratives show how quickly a social contract dissolved when the stakes were immediate. Mutiny is often dramatized as a sudden rebellion. In reality, it was frequently the final act of cumulative stress. A day that begins with a disease outbreak and ends with ration theft, a captain's harsh sentence, and a ship heeling under bad weather can produce a near-immediate breakdown in cooperation. If men stop bailing because they believe the captain will abandon them to drown, the ship's prospects spiral. Conversely, captains might prioritize the ship over individuals, jettison goods, cut away disabled crew, or make strategic choices that save the many at the cost of a few. Harsh though it sounds, such calculus was often the difference between a drifting wreck and a vessel that might limp home. Now stitch these threads together into a single composite day, plausible, historically grounded, and designed to show how quickly overlapping failures led to catastrophe. Start before dawn with an infected cask and a sleeping nest of rats burrowing in a grain sack. A man drinks and falls ill by mid-morning with violent diarrhea. The surgeon, called from below, is himself shivering with fever, nightmare symptoms of typhus perhaps, because he tended the first patient without changing his garments. With the surgeon incapacitated, septic wounds go untended. At noon, a brisk squall, sudden and merciless, swinging gusts catch the ship broadside. A heavy spar snaps, taking the mainmast with a thunderous crack that tosses 2 men overboard. The helmsman, already weak from lack of sleep and a small fever, misreads a gust and the rudder loses purchase. The pump crew, halved by illness, struggle. Tar and oakum are wet with salt and will not hold a new seam. A leaking seam that could have been managed in calm conditions becomes a flood point in the pitch of the storm. Within hours, the hold smells of seawater and rot. The bilge swells. Those with scalded palms from earlier repair work face crusted wounds that pucker and blacken in the salt air. Men slip in blood and vomit. The barked orders of the captain dissolve into frantic shouting. Some bind their mates with rope to keep them from slipping overboard. Others crawl delirious to the rail and fall in without hand. A legal port far across a sea lane refuses the ship entry when the sentries see the black flags of contagion. Quarantine protocols, primitive and merciless, were a response to exactly this calculus. Better to turn a potentially infected vessel away than to risk an entire port. So the ship is left to drift with a crippled crew. Without fresh water, without a surgeon, and with the hull opening to the sea, the day's losses are not limited to sickness or drowning alone. They compound. The next sunset will come with fewer hands, and by the following dawn, the casualty list grows because a combination of exposure, lack of care, and the sea's indifference turns isolated failures into mass mortality. Why does this matter beyond the shock value? Because these risks shape the slow accretion of maritime policy, practice, and technology. Contemporaries and later authorities took note of what failed and tried to fix it. Ports that had been ravaged by ships carrying pestilence instituted quarantine regimes, lazarettos and isolation islands where a vessel would wait, sometimes weeks, before being allowed ashore. Ship owners began to demand more competent surgeons, or at least men with steadier hands and better stock of remedies, because the cost of losing a crew outweighed the wage of a more skilled practitioner. Improvements in provisioning and food storage, better stowage, inferentially improved casks, and eventually knowledge about citrus and fresh supplies, reduced some risks on long voyages. Even if those solutions weren't immediate in the 1500s, shipbuilders learned, too. The horror of worm-eaten timbers and leaky seams pushed gradual refinements in hull construction and maintenance practices. Centuries later, copper sheathing and improved pumps would dramatically change the calculus. In the 1500s, however, those remedies were not yet widespread. There is also a lesson about networks. These ships were the arteries of a new global economy. That same connectedness that delivered spices and silver carried vermin and disease. The ocean was not merely a backdrop, but an active participant in historical change, sometimes generous, sometimes indifferent, often deadly. Understanding the medieval and early modern maritime world as a set of tightly coupled systems helps explain not only why a single day could be so fatal, but why states and merchants eventually altered behavior. To protect profit and people, one required rules of quarantine, more professional crews, and better equipment. Those changes were slow and uneven, but they were responses to harsh, repeated lessons. It's important to be clear about what we can say with confidence and what remains reconstruction. Contemporary logs and accounts provide vivid fragments. Men laid low by the flux, captains refusing harbor, surgeons writing of flux and ague, but they rarely offer modern clinical certainty. When I describe dysentery or typhus, I am drawing on patterns of symptoms and transmission behaviors that fit the historical record, not issuing retrospective diagnoses for named individuals. Likewise, the composite scenes I've just laid out are plausible constructions built from many primary observations and secondary analyses, not citations of a single ship's day-by-day narrative. The goal is to show how independent hazards interact, not to pretend that every voyage ended in the same fashion. There is a moral and a modern echo here. Systems that connect people also concentrate vulnerability. In the 1500s, a wooden ship, a handful of men, and a single contaminated barrel could be enough to turn a day into a disaster. Today, our transport networks are more complex, our medicine more sophisticated, and yet the underlying dynamics, interconnected pathways, invisible threats, and fragile human systems still apply. The past does not condemn us, it instructs. It shows how risk compounded when safeguards were absent, and how iterative improvements, quarantine laws, better surgeons, improved provisioning, arose because people had to learn fast or die. So would you survive a single day at sea in the 1500s? If you boarded unprepared as a modern passenger, without knowledge of seamanship, without immunity to whatever scourge a trading port had incubated, and without a crew fully healthy and equipped, your odds would be grim. The 99% is shorthand, an invitation to imagine the stacked deck against you, to appreciate how small failures cascade into catastrophe. For those who lived it, the ocean demanded constant labor, constant vigilance, and sometimes impossible choices. For historians, the lesson is humbling. People navigated these lethal microcosms not only by skill, but with a kind of stubborn endurance that shapes how we think about risk today. If this reconstruction left you wanting more scenes, more technical detail, or a deeper look at how quarantine and shipboard medicine evolved, subscribe and keep watching. There's a long history of survival at sea we've only begun to unravel. When the lanterns gutter and the sea coughs against the planking, the past keeps its lessons close to the skin. We can map the hazards, name the vectors, and sketch the policies that followed. But the basic fact remains. The 1500 ship was a sealed community, where tiny faults could become fatal storms. I'm Tim, watching the past so we can better read the present. And tomorrow we'll take a closer look at one of the long-term responses to these dangers, the slow professionalization of shipboard medicine, and the practices that finally began to turn the tide. If you found this reconstruction useful, share it with someone who likes grim curiosity and deep history, and we'll see you next time.